Welcome to Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 41. On today's show, I am talking with Tiffany Ciccone, who is an English teacher and also working on writing a book about her anxiety. So, Tiffany, welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you're going to talk with us about some of your personal experiences and your book writing process.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm stoked to be here and have this opportunity.
Yeah, we actually met on social media through Instagram because you're in the process of writing this book about your personal story with anxiety. And so I'm curious what that process has been like for you, just like opening up and sharing your story.
Sure. So it started a long time ago. Basically, when I was first diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, I did what we would all do. And I went home and Googled it hard.
Everything.
Yep, I Googled it all. And there was a lot I found about, like what is generalized anxiety disorder and what are the symptoms. But there's a whole part of me that wasn't addressed anywhere online. I couldn't find it anywhere. It was back in 2006. And so it was kind of early on with the whole mental health awareness thing. And there were no Christians talking about generalized anxiety disorder. There were Christians talking about, oh, don't worry, trust God, and he takes care of the sparrows, he'll take care of you, and all that good stuff. But, I grew up in the church and I already knew that stuff. It wasn't what my problem was. And I just felt so alone. There was nobody talking about and describing what I was going through. And so that night, when I was on my laptop looking for people I could relate to, I think that's the moment the book was conceived, because I came across this quote by Toni Morrison, and she says, if you can't find the book you want to read, then you need to write it. And
that's so good.
So that was what I had to do. And it was like 10 years until I started writing it, because there was a lot I had to go through first, a lot of healing that took place. And I didn't know in that moment that I was going to write a book. But yeah, since then, it's been a ride. So I'm an English teacher, and 10 years into teaching, my husband and I moved from the Bay Area to San Diego, and that cleared up some time for me. And I started writing. I just started blogging because, if I want to write, I can. Nothing's stopping me. So I started a blog, and I noticed that all of my content started to kind of focus around one topic, and that was the intersection of anxiety and my faith. So I kind of decided, you know what, this topic is really nuanced, it's really deep, and it deserves its own book. So I stepped away from the blog and I started outlining a book, and it's been a challenging, worthwhile process. And it's been a few years now kind of working through it. And I have a manuscript now. It's over 100 pages. And I'm at kind of a fun point where it's like a jigsaw puzzle. I'm trying to see kind of how these different pieces I wrote fit together. And I'm hoping and praying that it can help people kind of in that moment where I found myself, where, who can relate to this? Who's been here before? Who can tell me what to do and give me encouragement that I need? I'm hoping and praying that this book can be that for people in their early diagnosis, or maybe, long into their diagnosis, and they just want to read someone's story who's resonates with theirs.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, just from my own searches of who is actually speaking into this space about having a clinical level of anxiety, not just an anxiety that everybody faces on a day-to-day basis, because everybody goes through some level of anxiety at some point or another in their life. But when you're talking about things like, I don't know if this is part of your story, but when you're talking about dealing with things like panic attacks or just intense episodes of anxiety, not being able to shut off the worries, it's just a whole different level. And a lot of times people in the church will kind of approach it like it's just kind of, oh, it's every day, like normal anxiety like I deal with, and not really realizing, no, it's really a little bit more complex than that. So some of the things that might be helpful for day-to-day worries, anxieties, fears are not going to be necessarily the same things that are going to be helpful for generalized anxiety disorder. And I think, kind of you and I probably share some similarities in that we want to get this message out there and haven't seen people who are talking about it. And it's kind of part of what's propelled this podcast too. So it's really great to have you on to talk about this. So tell us a little bit about, in terms of your symptoms, like when did you first start to experience anxiety, even if you didn't know that's what it was called?
I think the first kind of manifestation was in my childhood. I had a lot of health anxiety. Back then, we called it hypochondria, but I was just writing about it the other day. It would be like the craziest, littlest things, like a bump on my shin, and I would go crying to my dad that I have a tumor in my shin. When I first found split ends, I was in third grade, I think, on a trip with my grandparents. And the trip was great until I saw the split end, and I just knew, like, this is cancer. Like, what else could this possibly be? And when I came home, I just felt the weight of the world as I had to tell my parents that, their oldest daughter's dying. And I wasn't afraid of the death part. I was really afraid of ruining my parents' lives, of bringing them all this sorrow and grief and through a medical nightmare. And that kind of incident just repeated itself throughout. Probably when I was like 20, it kind of like eased up and stopped. And I was really blessed that my dad gave me extra reassurance, and some of the logical things that he talked me through when I would freak out got kind of embedded in me. So
you can start to challenge
time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He didn't know it, but he was teaching me a part of cognitive behavioral therapy in giving me good ways to challenge those thoughts. Also, I recently read on, I think it was the National Institute for Mental Health, that children who are really shy, that can be one indicator. Later on, maybe there would be an anxiety disorder. I was a super shy kid. I was put in a study, an experimental play group where super shy kids and overly aggressive kids were combined.
Oh, no, that sounds awful.
I know,
who thought of that
one? I know. Great opportunity for bullying. But I don't know if it really worked with me, but it wasn't horrible. The toys were great, and I don't remember anyone beating me up. So
that's good.
Yeah. So I don't think I was healed by it, but that's just like how shy I was. I remember also some perfectionism. Like, I wouldn't know the answer to a question, or I'd be confused in class. And there's one time in computer class where the teacher kept saying to push return. And I was like, I don't know what return is. What's return? Oh my gosh. And I ended up bursting out crying, like hysterically crying. And so I can see moments like that where it's just like, that doesn't seem quite normal. I can see anxiety there. And then in my adolescence, a few symptoms took me to my doctor. And those are symptoms of anxiety, muscle tension. I had really tight back muscles. He had to give me shots in my back to loosen them up.
Wow.
I went to him because my hands were tingling, and I thought I had diabetes because of my, health anxiety. And it was because I was hyperventilating, and I didn't believe him. So he had me breathe into a paper bag, and I'm like, okay. And then I, as a teenager, I had perfectionism in the context of relationships. I would be crying late in the day because I said something to someone and I thought it would have hurt them or something. And then in college, I overthought a lot, and I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders with a lot of things. So really, I do see a lot of pieces of it growing up.
Yeah, it seems like you were a shy, but also very conscientious child of trying to please everyone and making sure they're happy. And then that pressure that it doesn't necessarily have to be pressure that other people put on you. You can put it on yourself, oh, I've got to do a good job, or I've got to be perfect at this. And then when it doesn't happen, you don't know how to respond. In the school scenario, it's and that just creates so much anxiety. It makes a lot of sense. How old were you when you were actually diagnosed?
I was 23.
Okay. Wow. So you had been dealing with it for years, really, before you got a formal diagnosis. Even with everything you went through with the doctor in high school and stuff, they weren't able to identify it and pinpoint it. That's interesting. So what was that process for you of getting help for your anxiety?
Well, Yeah, the awareness was at like zero. I had grown up in a church where it was an evangelical free church with a great youth group. But I never forget the most memorable sermon I've sat through. Our head pastor said that anxiety is a sin, depression is a sin. There's spiritual problems that need spiritual solutions. You need more faith, that kind of a thing. And I was probably 20 when I heard it, and it struck me as wrong then because I knew people who were depressed or who struggled with rage and who had, traumatic pasts. And
Sure.
it was harsh. And so I grew up in that kind of context. And at the same time, I had a strong faith myself. I'd been on mission trips. I'd learned to trust God. I'd learned to be flexible. I grew up with this understanding that anxiety is for when you're not trusting God with things that are beyond your control. Whereas my problem was I was freaking out about what was under my control. That was my anxiety, that I was going to screw up what's on my end. Yeah, so I couldn't see it. I actually ran into like one of my best friend's moms back when just before I was diagnosed, and I was losing my functionality, basically. I ran into her at a grocery store and we chatted for a moment. She was actually also a trained biblical counselor at church. So I ran into the supermarket. We chatted. I was super anxious at the time because it was hard for me to choose groceries because of my indecision. And she called me later that evening. She'd never called me before. My friend's mom, and she wanted to check in because she said it seemed like something was off. Like, what's going on? Are you okay? And I didn't have much of an explanation for her. And I think she was probably hoping for some breakthrough, some spiritual something or other. And, I just kind of told her my life circumstances, and I didn't have words for the anxiety part because it hadn't been addressed yet. And she couldn't identify it. So that just goes to show the level of unawareness that was present in kind of the Christian culture I was in. So I mentioned I was losing functionality. So my saving grace that brought me to a therapist was my husband. At the time, we were just dating, and he got a front center row look at my life and how I was doing emotionally and mentally. And he saw me break down at Target over like what toothpaste to buy. He saw me break down at church, and I had no clue why. I was hysterically crying. And he's like, honey, what's wrong? And I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And he just hugged me and he said, I think you should see someone. And I was like, oh, you mean like a therapist? And he's like, yes. And it gave me permission to seek help. That's gave
awesome.
It gave me a direction to go in. It wasn't like, oh, I'm so offended because you're saying I need professional help. Like, that's what I needed. And also at that time, I was in my first year of teaching, which is known to be a disaster. Like, regardless of how mentally healthy you are, that's supposed to challenge your mental health. And so I also had this disorder where I overthought every decision I was making in the classroom. So the kids' behavior was a disaster, and I was just getting like psychological beatdowns all the time. So it was the hardest year of my life. I also developed a jaw disorder, and that goes hand in hand with the muscle tension that we see with generalized anxiety disorder. So I was like drinking these awful like lukewarm smoothies at lunch in school, and not
just
chewing
like
food
from clenching. Like, was that from clenching your jaw, like out of anxiety, or?
Yeah, it was from clenching, and they said malocclusion. So my teeth just didn't fit together right.
Oh, okay.
So I'd have to like shift my jaw to get my teeth to fit together right. And my jaw had clicked since I was a senior in high school, but my dentist didn't really give me any guidance from there. And so basically by the time I graduated college, it was really, really painful. I went to a specialist at UC San Francisco, got physical therapy. I still see a physical therapist from time to time. So it was just kind of this convergence of all of these really stressful things. And forgot to mention, I was also earning my master's degree long distance through my credential program. So all of that, like, it just broke me. And I actually knew a couple other people in my master's program who also dropped out because they couldn't handle it. I don't know if they were having mental breaks like I was, but I just got to the point where I was kind of barely functional.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good point because it's one thing to be aware of your symptoms. And it's another thing to then be able to turn around and communicate those. Like sometimes all you can say is, I just feel like a mess, or I don't feel well, or I'm miserable and I don't know why. But it's sometimes until you get, around a therapist or a doctor to really ask you very specific questions, like what's your sleep like? What's your eating? How do your muscles feel? Do you experience this or that? Oh, okay. And then you're better able to tease out and communicate some of those symptoms. I know just from being a counselor and working with a lot of people with anxiety, sometimes people, say things like, I don't feel well. I know I'm anxious. I don't feel good. I just want to feel better. And it's really just being able to tease some of those things out to figure out what people's symptoms are and what they actually need. Like, where's our starting point here?
Yeah, that was very much that describes what it was like for me. And I recently heard of the term free floating anxiety. And I certainly had that where it just stuck around. Yeah. And I didn't know what it was or what to do with it. I just knew that my breathing feels funny. I know I can't concentrate anymore, but I had no idea why.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit in terms of like how responses were in the church. You were just hearing, okay, well, pretty much it's your fault. You're not trusting God in some way, or this is a spiritual issue that you need help for. Like, how did you resolve some of those messages and turn them from like unhealthy messages, which is what I believe those are, into something healthier and kind of make some resolution or peace with your faith?
That's a great question. And it's a really complicated, layered answer, I think, hence a book.
Sure.
So we'll see what words I can think of right now. Therapy really helped.
Okay.
And she wasn't a Christian therapist, but she was a good therapist who knew how to take my religious beliefs and work with them.
Sure. Sure. That's good.
And I was warned, in a large sense at my church, I was warned against secular therapy. I was warned against medication, like the Bible only is all we need. Why would you let the world help you in the way that God can help you through the Bible? But this was different. It was clinical, like you said earlier, it's not a spiritual issue of trusting God. It had a much more profound, complicated effect on my relationship with God, actually. So my therapist helped me turn that around. I saw her for 2 years. At the end of my first year, I went on medication as well. She worked with my doctor. So a little bit also of my kind of getting help story. I started with my doctor. I made an appointment and I told him how I was feeling. I was crying myself to sleep. And part of that was just sheer loneliness, especially before I met my husband. And I shouldn't say sheer loneliness. It was a convergence of everything. Sure. But so thankfully, he didn't just write me a prescription. He referred me to 3 cognitive behavioral therapists. He said, the research shows this is the most effective treatment. Here's 3 good ones I know of. And this is the same doctor that I grew up with, actually, who didn't catch the isolated symptoms.
Sure.
But when I told him, I kind of saw the wheels turn into his head. He was like, oh, you always have been pretty, he said, pretty hyper. And I'm yeah. And we had this thing where my blood pressure was always elevated at the doctor's office because of my health anxiety. So my mannerisms, I suppose. I've always been hyper. So he led me to my therapist. So then a year into therapy, I'd learned cognitive behavioral journaling. And that was a huge help because I'd always been a journaler. And that was a huge coping mechanism for me before I was diagnosed. I can look back in my journals, like in high school, and I see that I'm coming to my journal to seek what the heck is happening in my head. I'm like, I'm feeling this way. Why, God? And then I kind of dialogue with God through prayer in my journal and do some sort of, similar thing to cognitive behavioral therapy. And so when I learned the formal structure, that would really help me. And when I learned cognitive distortions and I learned to identify what thought was what cognitive distortion, and then how to deal with those distortions. There was a lot of healing there, but then the triggers kept popping up. So I'd like have an anxious thought, deal with it. 30 minutes later, it's back, but it's a different topic. So I deal with that. 30 minutes later, I feel it again. And so that's when my therapist called my doctor and he started me on medication. And then that medication journey started. I'm still on it today. And it gives me, and I've been on various ones over time, it gives me a strong baseline to work from. And it makes the incidents much fewer. I don't have it pop up as frequently. So those things, ironically, the things that my church had warned me against are the things that helped me see more clearly what was happening to me and brought me back to truth. Because when my anxiety got under control, I was able to see God more clearly along with everything else. And I was able to concentrate in prayer again. And before, I was so confused as to why I couldn't connect with God like I used to. And I thought it was a sin issue. I heard Christians say before that Christians would mention this feeling of, I feel convicted of sin. And I'd always thought, like, what is that? Like, I don't really feel that. And so then when I had these new feelings of anxiety, I'm like, oh my gosh, this must be conviction of sin. What's wrong? And I would search my heart. I would do all the right things to try and find answers with God. And I would come up with nothing. I was stuck. And then that just exacerbated things and kept the cycle going of this scrupulosity, to use a new word that I recently learned, my obsessing over pleasing God, my obsessing over, I don't want to be a failure to God. And I felt like his little failure. I obsessed about what is the will of God. And then when I moved to San Diego, I mentioned the move, I started a new church. I stopped going to that other church. I didn't keep going and going, but okay. The other churches in between, we went to my husband's a little while and, they were okay, nothing major either way. But I didn't open up about my anxiety because all I had known was that people are not going to understand. The church's definition of anxiety is totally different from my experience of it. They should have different words, in my opinion.
Sure.
Yeah. So when I moved down to San Diego, this new church, the second sermon I heard there was a couple on stage and they were giving their testimony and it involved infidelity. Okay. And my husband and I were sitting there like with our mouths wide open. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, okay, if they can talk about this here from the stage, I can talk about my anxiety.
Wow. And yeah. So freeing.
And by that time, I was 10 years into this journey with anxiety, and I had actually gone into remission at a point where my anxiety was under control. It was minimal. And I remember one of the things my therapist told me when she graduated me at the end of my 2 years with her. She said, don't be surprised if this comes back during a major life transition. Like if
stress.
If you have a baby, if you move. And sure enough, I quit my job of 11 years in the Bay Area, quit the ministry I was involved with, moved down to the Bay Area. I'd moved down to San Diego and I was unemployed for a while. That was my big trigger. And my anxiety came back with new manifestations too. It was far more physical than before, far less of the thoughts. So it was harder for me to cope because it was harder to find the thoughts underneath the physical symptoms. And I had just had it. I was like, you know what? I've done this before. I've been here. I've been through the therapy. I've been through the stigma, whatever. I'm done. I'm talking about it. And so I started writing about it more freely. I just put it all on paper. I would talk about it. And my church really embraced that. And I could give you great examples of it if we have time for it, if you want to take it in that direction. Yeah.
It seems like hearing somebody else's story, that totally freed you up and reduced shame and stigma to allow you to share your story. And then I'm sure you sharing your story has blessed someone else in the church who thought, oh gosh, I just thought I was sitting here and I was the only one going through anxiety. Because I do think that happens a lot in church, unfortunately. If we don't open up and we don't talk about these things, or we don't say, I look at my clients who talk about their therapy openly to other people, and oftentimes that will free someone up in their life to get therapy. because then their friend or family member, whoever, will go, oh, you're getting therapy? Like, I guess it's okay then. It's that whole reducing the stigma and just kind of making it more of a normal process that it's okay to go through. Yeah. That's awesome. And I love what you said too earlier about how it's almost like anxiety was this cloud in between you and your relationship with God, where you had a hard time seeing God clearly or connecting with him because this was in the way. And I really believe that as we're able to work through some of those things, that we have a clearer picture of who God is, of how much he loves us, so that, he's for us. And it just changes things a lot in terms of that positive connection with God.
Yeah, I kind of felt in one of those moments, I felt the prayer where I forget who it was, but a man in the Bible tells Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief.
Yes.
And in those moments where the anxiety was heavy, it's like, God, I know these things deep in my gut, but they are not true in my, I can't I can't grasp them rationally. And I don't know why or how. And God was definitely good in that he did help me, brought me to that therapist and brought me on this huge journey since then.
So what I used to do on my show is I'd have guests on and I'd say, okay, now tell me a story of hope, sometime where you receive hope from God. And then I started doing more of these personal stories. It just didn't really make sense because your whole story is hopeful, right? So I decided that this go around of recordings, I'm going to shift the question, the kind of some of our closing question a little bit. So your closing question is, if you could go back in time, what encouragement or hope would you provide to your younger self?
This is a great question. And I gave it a bit of thought, and I kind of came up with everything I needed, basically to my younger self. If I'm going to look at this literally, I wouldn't give myself any extra encouragement or hope where I was, because God gave me what I needed when I needed it through people, through things like this podcast. And I wouldn't change that journey, painful as it was, because God is a beautiful artist. But there are things I decided what I wanted to share was what I wanted to hear that night when I realized nobody understood. Nobody was talking about what I was going through. So if I could, I think I'd just close by reading a piece. I have a writing coach, and he challenged me if I only had 15 minutes, and don't worry, this isn't 15 minutes of reading. If I only had 15 minutes with the people who I'm writing for, what would I tell them? So I'm just going to read that, if that's okay. Okay, cool. Or apart from it anyway. Okay. So this is, I feel like, what I needed to hear. We have been told that as Christians, we shouldn't be anxious or depressed. This makes us feel like crap because anxiety and depressive disorders don't really give us a choice. Scriptures like be anxious for nothing and rejoice in the Lord always are directed and fired at us by church leaders, Christian authors, and friends and family who like to tack on offhand remarks and platitudes. When I'm anxious, be anxious for nothing just makes me feel like that much more of a failure. They don't understand the desperate darkness we're dealing with or what it stems from. They expect us to be able to remove the very thorns that God alone can remove. Because the experience is limited and because they forget to listen, they assume that depressive disorders are the same as their own struggle with discontentment. And they assume that anxiety disorders are the same as their own struggle to trust God with the present and future. In fact, I consider it a misnomer to use the word anxiety for both their spiritual struggles and our visceral psychological disorders. I know it's cheesy, but it might help a little bit to refer to the clinical stuff as thorny, after the thorn that the Apostle Paul was inflicted with. That's how I think we need to understand our disorders. See if Paul's experience resonates with yours. And then this is 2 Corinthians 12:7. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Like Paul and his thorn, none of us ask for our disorders. They harass harass us. They keep us from being conceited, from thinking rationally, and from being generally functional. They keep us weak. And in the presence of tears and the collapsing and the haze and the stigma, in the midst of it all, we find that his grace is sufficient. This is the real gospel, a gospel of weakness. The mistaken American church preaches a gospel of strength, self-sufficiency, and name it and claim it success and healing. In short, it's kind of like the Pharisees. No wonder it is obsessed with removing thorns, with all its books and sermons about overcoming anxiety and depression. It has forgotten Jesus' words, "Blessed are the weak in spirit." It has forgotten that our King was a man of sorrow, well acquainted with grief. It has forgotten how the heart of God grieves the fall of his beloved mankind. It has forgotten that in our very nature, we are all weak. It is distant from the truth and its source. In this ironic sense, we are blessed. Our thorns remind us that we need rescue. They keep us tethered to our Savior and the source of truth. I need to be rescued regularly from the adrenaline that just shoots on for no reason, when my prefrontal cortex just shuts down. I need to be rescued when my mind turns on me and a thick fog sets in over the truth. Over the years, these words of C.S. Lewis have given me great comfort. They have done the rare thing of understand me as a person of faith with an anxiety disorder. C.S. Lewis says this: if you are a poor creature, poisoned by a wretched upbringing in some house full of vulgar jealousies and senseless quarrels, saddled by no choice of your own with some loathsome sexual perversion, parenthetically I put, or bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or panic disorder, or any of those, nagged day in and out by an inferiority complex that makes you snap at your best friends, do not despair. He knows all about it. You are one of the poor whom he blessed. He knows what a wretched machine you are trying to drive. Keep on. Do what you can. One day, perhaps in another world, but perhaps far sooner than that, he will fling it on the scrap heap and give you a new one. And then you may astonish us all, not least yourself, for you have learned you're driving in a hard school. The church's obsession with curing anxiety and depression is out of control. What if Paul came across a book called Remove Your Thorn, or Pray Your Thorn Away, or Choose Christ, Not Your Thorn? Would Paul feel like a failure? Would he wonder, what am I doing wrong? Would he obsessively search for some horrible sin that must be preventing his thorn removal? What would it cause him to spiral like I do? I'll never know the anxiety of Gethsemane. It's a good thing that Paul's thorn wasn't removed. I have no more ability to cure my anxiety than Paul was able to remove his own thorn. And also, like Paul, it doesn't mean I don't try. I'm surprised he only asked God 3 times. I've asked I've asked a bazillion. While God has not cured me, lest I become conceited, he has done so much healing, especially through means that have been denounced by many in the church, like secular therapy, medication, nature, self-care. Do what you can. Here's my closing. Do what you can to take care of the body God gave you. I'm still learning how to take care of mine. Ours might be a little janky, but remember, God redeems all things janky. Let's get comfortable with the lot we've been given, not complacent, not giving up, but doing what we can and then surrendering the rest to Jesus. Perhaps the goal is to trust God with our anxiety disorders, that even if healing doesn't come, that we may have the posture of the Mother of God. Quote, I am willing to be used of the Lord. Let it happen to me as you have said. Luke, that's from Luke 1. That's my prayer of submission when I can't shake my anxiety. That's the end. And that was way longer than I thought it would be.
Oh, wow. That is so good. Tiffany, we really need this book out. And so we will definitely let people know. Whenever you let me know that it's going to be out, I will let the people know, because I love that. I feel like we share a similar heartbeat for people in the church who are struggling. So thank you so much for being brave and coming on here and talking about your own struggles. I know this is definitely going to be relatable to our audience, and that people are going to be blessed by the encouragement.
Cool. Thank you so much. I hope so.
Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. Our show is hosted by me, Carrie Bach, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. Opinions given by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself or By the Well Counseling. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.